Welcome back to Park Ranger Files. Tonight we are leaving the trails behind and walking into something a lot quieter and a lot colder. Appalachia is full of towns that used to be full of people. Story 1. I've been doing estate liquidation and antique appraisal work in the mountains of West Virginia for almost 17 years. It is not glamorous work. Most of the time it means going through a dead person's house with a clipboard, deciding what is worth selling and what is worth throwing in a dumpster, and trying not to think too hard about the fact that everything in front of you used to matter to somebody. I got into this line of work because my grandmother did it before me, and she always said the job teaches you to listen to houses. I did not understand what she meant until the fall of 2021, when a lawyer out of Beckley hired me to catalog the contents of a property near a town called Cross Hollow. Cross Hollow does not exist on modern maps. It was a coal camp built in the 1910s, owned outright by the mining company the way a lot of those towns were, and it emptied out fast after a methane explosion in 1954 killed 11 men underground. The company shut the mine within the year, and within 5 years the whole town was gone. The houses left standing because nobody wanted to pay to tear them down. What was left was one property that had somehow stayed in a single family's name through all of it. A 2-story frame house at the end of what used to be Company Row. And that house was what I had been hired to empty out. The last owner, an elderly man named Wendell Ashcraft, had died in a nursing home 3 counties away and had not set foot in the house in over a decade. But he had never sold it. And his will specified that whatever was inside should be appraised and either sold at auction or donated. I drove out there on a gray October morning with my assistant Priya, who was 23 at the time and had never worked a job this remote. The road into Cross Hollow is barely a road anymore, just 2 ruts through weeds with a creek running alongside it, and you have to park about a quarter mile out and walk in because the county stopped maintaining the bridge decades ago. What struck me first was how intact everything still looked from a distance. Most ghost towns I've worked in the mountains have collapsed into piles of rotted lumber within a generation. But Cross Hollow still had maybe a dozen structures, standing more or less upright, their porches sagging but their bones holding, like the town was waiting for someone to come finish a conversation it had started 70 years ago. The Ashcraft house was the last one, before the road curved up toward where the mine entrance used to be. It still had glass in most of its windows, which is unusual for a place abandoned that long, and the front door was unlocked. The way houses in dead towns often are, because there is nobody left to steal from or protect anything from. Inside, the air had that specific mineral cold that old coal country houses hold on to, a cold that feels like it is coming up through the floor rather than in through the walls. The furniture was still arranged like someone lived there. A table set for 2. A rocking chair positioned facing the front window, like someone had been sitting in it watching the road. Priya and I worked through the ground floor first, cataloging dishware and furniture and a surprising amount of intact glassware, the kind of work that is tedious but not unsettling. It was around 2 in the afternoon, with the light already starting to go flat and gray, the way it does early in mountain hollows in October, when Priya called me upstairs because she had found something odd in the back bedroom. It was a child's room, small, with a single bed and a wardrobe. And on the wall above the bed, someone had painted, not written, but actually painted with what looked like house paint, a long list of names. 11 names. I did not need to count them twice to understand what they were. The men who died in the 1954 explosion. Someone had turned a child's bedroom wall into a memorial, and beneath the names, in the same hand, was written the words, "They are still down there." We kept working. I want to be honest that at the time, I did not think much of it beyond finding it sad and strange. The kind of thing you see in these houses that makes the job feel heavier than it should. It was closer to 4:30, with maybe 40 minutes of usable light left, when I heard the first sound from the mine entrance up the hill. a sound like metal striking rock, rhythmic, 3 strikes and a pause, 3 strikes and a pause. Priya heard it too and asked if there were other appraisers up there, and I told her honestly that as far as I knew, we were the only people within 2 miles. We went out onto the porch to listen, and the sound continued, steady, patient, coming from somewhere up the slope where the mine entrance had long since been sealed with a concrete cap by the state. What happened next is the part I have gone back and forth on how to describe, because I do not want to make it sound like more than it was, and I also do not want to make it sound like less. As we stood on that porch listening to something striking rock inside a sealed mine shaft, the front door of the house across the road, a house we had not yet entered and had assumed was empty like all the others, swung open on its own. Not blown by wind, there was no wind that afternoon, but opened the way a door opens when someone on the inside turns the handle and pushes. Nothing came out. The doorway just stood open, black inside, facing us, and the striking sound from the mine stopped the instant it opened, like whatever had been doing it was now listening too. I am not an easily rattled person. 17 years of walking into dead people's houses will strip most of the superstition out of you. But I told Priya to get her things, and we left the Ashcraft house without finishing the ground floor inventory, and we did not go back that day. Before we made it back to the truck that first afternoon, something else happened that I have never quite been able to fold into a tidy explanation. We were walking the ruts back toward where we had parked, moving quickly, both of us rattled more than either of us wanted to admit out loud, when Priya stopped dead in the road and grabbed my arm. She was staring back at the house we had just left, and when I followed her line of sight, I saw smoke rising thin and gray from the chimney. The specific lazy curl of smoke that only comes from a fire that has been burning a while, not one just lit. That house had been cold and empty when we walked through it not 20 minutes earlier. No fireplace laid, no ash even, just old dust undisturbed on the hearth. We stood there for what felt like a long time, watching that smoke rise against the darkening sky, and neither of us said a single word, and neither of us went back to check. By the time we reached the truck and I glanced back one final time before the bend in the road took the house out of view, the smoke was gone, and the chimney sat as cold and dead as it had looked from the porch that morning. I want to tell you the story ends there, that we simply came back with more people and better light, and finished the job without incident. And mostly, that is true. One thing did happen on that second trip that I have never fully mentioned, even to Priya, because I did not want to give it more weight than it deserved. While the 2 other appraisers worked through the kitchen and parlor, I spent a portion of the morning in the cellar, cataloging canning jars and old tools, and found, tucked behind a support post, a small tin box containing letters, most of them addressed to Wendell as a boy from his father. Ordinary letters about weather and work and small hopes for the future. Nothing unusual until the last one in the stack, dated only weeks before the explosion, in which his father wrote that he had a bad feeling about the shift schedule that month, and had asked to be moved to surface work, if at all possible. A request that, as I would later learn from the lawyer, had in fact been granted, sparing his life while 11 other men went into that mountain and never came back out. I left the letters exactly where I found them for the estate, but I copied that one page for myself before I did, and I still have it. We did return 4 days later with 2 other appraisers and finished the catalog without anything else happening that I could point to directly. But I will tell you one more thing, because it happened to me alone, and I've never fully explained it to anyone until now. On that second trip, while the others worked downstairs, I went back up to that child's bedroom to photograph the painted names for the estate records. And standing there with my camera, I noticed that the wall now read 12 names instead of 11, and the 12th name, added in paint that looked no older or fresher than the rest, was Renee. I did not tell Priya, I did not tell the lawyer. I photographed the wall exactly as it was, and I have that photograph still, filed away with 17 years of other estate records. The only one I have never shown a client. I've thought many times since about whether I should have told that buyer anything before the sale went through. And I've always landed on the same uncomfortable answer, which is that my job is to appraise and catalog, not to warn, and that whatever exists in that house was there long before I arrived, and will presumably remain long after any new owner comes and goes. Priya left the estate business entirely within a year of that job, moving into a different field altogether. And though she has never said so directly, I have always suspected Belcross Hollow had something to do with that decision. We do not talk about it when we run into each other now, but there is a particular look that passes between us whenever the subject of old coal towns comes up in conversation. A look that says more than either of us has ever managed to put into words. I've never been back to Belcross Hollow myself since that auction closed, though I did once take a call from a genealogy researcher tracing the Ashcraft family line, who mentioned in passing that Wendell had a sister who died as an infant sometime in the 1930s, decades before the explosion, buried in a small family plot that the researcher believed sat somewhere on the property itself, unmarked and long since overgrown. I've often wondered whether that painted wall in the child's bedroom, the one that grew a 12th name while I was standing in front of it, had less to do with the mine at all, and more to do with a much older grief that simply never got its own proper marker, one that found a way to fold itself into whatever else that house was keeping track of. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house where grief has been allowed to compound for generations without ever being properly spoken aloud. And Belcross Hollow had that quiet in a way I have not encountered in any property before or since, a stillness that did not feel empty, so much as attentive, as if the house itself had simply been waiting a very long time for someone to finally notice what it had been carrying. I think about that distinction often now, the difference between a place that is simply empty and a place that is waiting, because it changes how carefully you walk through a room, how quietly you set down your clipboard, how long you let yourself linger in a doorway before deciding it is safe to move on. Most houses I work in do not ask that of me. Belcross Hollow did. And some part of me has never fully stopped extending that same caution to every property since, just in case. My grandmother, who first taught me this trade and told me houses could be listened to, passed away several years before Belcross Hollow, and I have often wished I could have called her afterward, described exactly what happened, and asked her whether she had ever encountered anything like it in her own decades of work. I suspect, knowing her, that she would not have been surprised in the slightest, and that she likely would have simply nodded and told me that was the job. Plain as that. The same way she used to say it about everything else she taught me. I keep her old appraisal ledger on a shelf in my office now, its pages filled with decades of properties she cataloged long before I ever picked up this trade. And every so often, working late on a difficult estate, I will flip through it looking for some property she may have worked that sits near enough to one of mine to compare notes with a woman who is no longer here to answer, which is its own quiet kind of ritual I have never fully explained to anyone, including myself. Every so often, cataloging some other property in some other hollow, I will come across a wall with faint discoloration or a hidden compartment behind a baseboard. And before I even look closely, I find myself bracing for names, and more often than I would like to admit, I find them. The house sold at auction to an out-of-state buyer, who I understand never actually visited the property before purchasing it, which I have always found to be its own kind of mercy. I did some digging of my own after that, mostly because I could not let it go the way I usually can with strange jobs. I contacted the Beckley lawyer who had hired me and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether Wendell Ashcraft had any family connection to the 11 men killed in the 1954 explosion. The lawyer did not know offhand, but pulled some old company personnel files at my request. and it turned out Wendell's own father had been the 12th man scheduled to work that shift, pulled off the crew at the last minute by a foreman who needed him for surface work instead. A decision that saved his life and, by pure accident of scheduling, meant he alone among his usual crew walked out of that mine and lived to raise a family in that house on Company Row. I do not know what to do with that information, except to say it changed the way I understood that painted wall. It was not a memorial to strangers. It was a list kept by a family that had spent generations aware of exactly how close they had come to being on it. And Wendell, in his final years alone in that house, may have been the one who kept adding to it, a habit passed down or a promise kept, long after anyone else remembered why. I also spoke some months later with another appraiser who had worked briefly in the area, and who told me, unprompted, that she had heard similar accounts from a probate attorney about a different property near an old coal camp 2 counties over, where a family had kept what she called a debt list on a basement wall. Names of men lost in a separate accident, added to periodically by someone who was never home when neighbors checked. Whether that is the same practice under a different name, or simply a coincidence of grief repeating itself across these mountains, I could not tell you, but it has made me look differently at every wall I cataloged since. If you have ever stood somewhere you were not supposed to be and felt like the place was taking attendance, you understand why I still think about Bellcross Hollow more than any other job I have ever worked. Before we get to what happened to a lineman named Dale Whitfield in a flooded town not 40 miles from there, do me a favor and hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from tonight. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these accounts, and it means a lot to us. Now, let us keep going. Story 2. My name is Dale Whitfield, and I have worked for a regional power cooperative in eastern Kentucky for going on 22 years, most of that time as a lineman. When a storm takes out lines in the deep hollows, I'm one of the guys who goes in on foot or by four-wheeler when the trucks cannot get through, because those old mountain lines still run past places most people forgot existed. In March of 2019, we had a bad ice storm come through Letcher County, and I got sent out with a younger lineman named Todd Ferris to restore a line that ran along an old right-of-way into what used to be a town called Kestrel Gap. Kestrel Gap was a lumber town, not a coal town, built up fast in the early 1900s around a mill, and abandoned even faster once the surrounding ridges had been stripped of anything worth cutting. By the time the mill closed in 1938, most of the town had already been picked apart for salvage. But the power line running through it had never been decommissioned because it fed a relay station further down the valley. So the cooperative kept it live and kept it maintained, which meant every few years, somebody like me had to walk that dead town to check the poles. The morning we went in, the ground was still covered in a crust of ice from the storm, and everything had that specific silence that comes after an ice storm, where even birds seemed to be waiting for something. Todd and I found the break about a mile in, a line snapped by a fallen tree limb near what would have been the old mill office, and we set up to make the repair. What was left of Kestrel Gap by then was mostly foundations and a few brick chimneys standing without houses around them, the way chimneys do in these places, because brick outlasts wood by a long shot. There was also, standing more intact than anything else, the shell of what had been the company store, its roof mostly caved in, but its walls still square. Todd was up the pole working the splice, while I held the ladder and kept an eye on the tree line, which is just habit in that kind of work. You watch your surroundings while your partner works with live current. It was maybe 11 in the morning when I noticed movement near the old company store, a shape moving behind one of the empty window frames, low and quick, like someone crouching and moving from one window to the next. I called up to Todd asking if he saw anyone else out here, and he said no and kept working. I watched that store for another few minutes and saw the same low, quick movement pass behind a second window, and then a third. moving the length of the building faster than a person could reasonably move while staying crouched. I want to explain something about that country before I go further. There are wild dogs in those hollows. Packs of them descended from hunting dogs let loose or lost generations back. And my first assumption was that I was watching a dog moving along the inside of the store looking for a way out. That assumption held right up until the shape stopped at the last window and stood up to its full height. And its full height put its head above the window frame, which put it taller than any dog has business being. And it stayed there looking out at us for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 or 5 seconds before it dropped back down and went still. While Todd was still finishing the splice above me, I decided to walk a short distance toward the store to get a better look at what I'd seen, mostly to prove to myself it had been nothing. Some trick of shadow through broken glass. The closer I got, the more the building seemed to arrange itself wrong somehow. Doorways where the old photographs I had seen in a county history book did not place any. A second story visible through gaps in the collapsed roofline that should not have existed on a structure that size. I stopped about 20 feet from the entrance, close enough to smell something sweet and rotten drifting out from inside, like fruit left too long in a closed room. And it was standing there that I noticed the snow and ice on the ground leading up to the doorway had been disturbed. A single set of footprints, bare, walking out from inside the store and stopping abruptly at the exact spot where I stood, as though whoever made them had simply stopped existing mid-stride. There were no prints leading away in any direction. I backed up slowly, the way you back away from a dog you are not sure of, and did not go any closer for the rest of the day. Todd finished the splice not long after and climbed down, and I did not say anything to him about it right away because I did not know how to say it without sounding like I had lost my mind. Walking that stretch, I made a point of counting the windows on that store as we passed, a habit I picked up from years of doing safety walkdowns, where you catalog everything methodically, rather than let your eyes wander. There were 6 window openings along that side of the building, and in every one of them, for just a fraction of a second as my eyes passed over it, I caught what looked like condensation, fogging the inside of the glass. The kind of fog that forms when someone is standing close enough to breathe on it. Gone by the time I looked directly at any single window. Todd noticed nothing of the sort, walking a few paces ahead of me with his eyes on the ground watching his footing on the icy ruts. And I did not point it out to him because by then I had started to suspect that whatever was in that store had decided, for reasons of its own, that I was the one it wanted to be noticed by. We started walking the line further to check the next few poles, which took us directly past the company store, close enough that I could see through the window frames into the dark inside. And I am telling you the truth when I say there was nothing in there. No dog, no person, nothing but rotted shelving and a floor thick with old leaves. Todd walked ahead of me the whole way and never once looked concerned, which told me whatever I had seen, he had not. We finished the job by early afternoon and started walking out. And it was on the way out, passing the store one final time, that I heard a voice from inside it, a man's voice, clear as anything, saying, "Take what you need. We are closing early today." It was said the exact way a shopkeeper says it at the end of a long day, tired and routine, not threatening at all, which is somehow what has stuck with me hardest about it. Because there was nothing scary in the tone, only in the fact that it came from an empty, ruined building, 40 feet from a man who had died working the same trade I did. I told Todd what I had heard once we were back at the truck, mostly to see his reaction. And he went pale and admitted that he had heard something too while he was up the pole. A voice underneath him near the base saying, "Watch your step now," and had assumed it was me joking around. There was one more visit, though, that I have not mentioned yet. A follow-up trip about 6 months after the ice storm job, required because the cooperative wanted photographic documentation of pole conditions along that whole stretch for an internal review. I went alone that time, under strict instructions to be quick and thorough, and I made a point of not looking directly at the company store as I passed, keeping my eyes on the poles and my camera and nothing else. I nearly made it the whole length of the line without incident until, walking back out near dusk, I heard footsteps falling into step directly behind me, matching my pace exactly, close enough that I could hear the crunch of boots on frozen ground, though I never once looked back to confirm it. I picked up my own pace and the footsteps matched it. I slowed deliberately and the footsteps slowed with me. It was only when I reached the edge of the old town boundary, marked by nothing more than a rusted survey stake half buried in leaves, that the footsteps stopped entirely, and I did not look back until I was well clear of the tree line and could see my truck waiting on the access road. Sitting in the cab afterward, hands still shaking slightly, I noticed a faint dusting of what looked like flour or fine chalk across the toes of both my boots, a substance I had not stepped in anywhere along that walk, and one that matched closely enough to bother me. Old company store records I later found describing flour sacks as one of Corliss's most reliably stocked goods, right up until the day the mill closed for good. I brushed it off my boots without thinking much of it at the time, and it was not until weeks later, reading through that oral history transcript, that the details settled into place and left me sitting at my kitchen table for a long while, not quite ready to go on to the next page. I keep that transcript printed out now, folded into the same binder where I log every pole inspection I have ever done for the cooperative, filed under Kestrel Gap, even though the line no longer runs there, because some part of me could not stand the idea of Corliss's account sitting only in a digital archive somewhere, unread, the same way his own store sat unvisited for so many years before anyone finally understood what had happened to him. Every time I train a new lineman on that stretch of the cooperative's territory, even now with the line rerouted well clear of the old town, I make a point of telling them the short version of what happened, not to scare them off the job, but because I think Corliss deserves to be remembered by more than just me, and because I would rather a young lineman walk into these hollows a little more careful than I was on my first pass through Kestrel Gap. Most of them listen politely and assume I am simply telling an old ghost story to pass the time on a long drive out to a job site. And I let them believe that if it makes the work easier for them, but I always watch their faces a little more closely on their first walk past wherever that old right-of-way used to run, just to see if any of them notice something I'm too used to noticing myself anymore. Most walk on without a flicker of reaction, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding each time that happens, relieved on their behalf, though there was one young apprentice a couple years back who paused at that exact stretch of road, looked up toward where the old store used to stand, and asked me, unprompted, if I had heard that too, and I did not need to ask him what he meant before I told him it was time to keep walking. Neither of us went back into Kestrel Gap after that day if we could help it, and when the cooperative eventually rerouted that line 2 years later to avoid the maintenance costs of accessing it, I did not put up any argument, and I do not think Todd did either. A few years after that job, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up whatever records the County Historical Society kept on Kestrel Gap, mostly expecting nothing beyond dates and production numbers. What I found instead was a short account written by a former resident in the 1980s, part of an oral history project, describing the mill's closing in 1938. According to that account, the store's final owner, a man remembered only by his last name, Corliss, refused to leave with the rest of the town, insisting that the company still owed back wages to workers who had already scattered to find jobs elsewhere, and that he intended to keep the store open and hold their pay until they came back for it. He was found dead in that store roughly a year later, alone, having apparently kept the shelves stocked and the till organized the entire time, waiting on customers who were never coming back. The oral history account ends with a line from the interviewer, noting that older residents used to say, You could still hear him calling last orders on quiet evenings, a detail that meant nothing to me until I read it, and that has meant a great deal to me since. I mentioned this to Todd the next time our paths crossed on a different job, and he went quiet for a moment before telling me he had never gone back to that stretch of woods, even to hunt, despite having hunted that whole county his entire life, and that he intended to keep it that way, regardless of what the cooperative decided to do with the line in the future. I have worked around live power lines for over 2 decades, and the thing that will kill you out there is rarely the thing you are watching for. Before we move on to what an urban explorer named Odessa Vance found underneath a town called Ashford Hollow, we would really appreciate it if you subscribed to this channel and turned on notifications, because these accounts come from real interviews, and we do not want you to miss the next one. Drop a comment if you have ever heard a voice out in the woods that had no business being there. Let us keep moving. Story 3. I run a small channel documenting abandoned places across the southern Appalachians. Mostly old towns, old asylums, old rail depots, the kind of places people forget on purpose. I do this full time now, which still surprises me some days. But back in 2020, it was still a side project. Something I did on weekends with a camera bag and a headlamp. In September of that year, I drove out to a town in the mountains of North Carolina called Ashford Hollow, which had been a tannery town until the 1940s and had been steadily swallowed by forest ever since. I had researched Ashford Hollow for weeks before going, the way I do with every location. And the thing that kept pulling my attention was a section of old newspaper archive mentioning that the tannery had built an underground storage cellar beneath the main processing building to keep hides cool before the era of refrigeration, and that the cellar had never been filled in when the rest of the town was cleared for salvage. An intact underground space in a town nobody visits anymore is exactly the kind of thing that gets my attention. So I went in alone, which I do not always recommend, but which I was used to doing at that point in my life. The tannery building itself was mostly gone above ground, just a brick foundation and a scatter of rusted machinery. But I found the cellar entrance where the archive said it would be, a stone stairwell leading down under a slab of collapsed roofing that I had to clear by hand. The air coming up from that stairwell was different from the air above ground, heavier, with a smell I can only describe as wet copper, and I remember hesitating there longer than I usually would before going in, because something about that smell felt less like old stone and old water and more like something organic. I went down anyway because that is the job, and the cellar opened into a low stone room, maybe 30 feet across, empty except for a scatter of broken barrels, and near the far wall, a series of marks scratched into the stone, dozens of them, arranged in tally groups of 5, the way people count days when they have nothing else to count with. I filmed all of it, narrating quietly the way I do for my videos. And it was while I was filming those tally marks that my camera light, which runs on a separate battery from my headlamp, died without warning. Fully charged battery going instantly dark in a way that has never happened to that equipment before or since. I want to explain something about how I normally work, because it matters for what happened next. I always narrate my videos in real time as I film, describing what I'm seeing and doing, partly for the audience, and partly because it keeps me calm and methodical in tight, uncomfortable spaces. Reviewing my own audio from that cellar later, I found something in the recording that I have no memory of experiencing in the moment. A second voice, quieter than mine, matching my cadence almost exactly, repeating fragments of my own narration back a half second behind me, like an echo that had learned to speak on its own. It is subtle enough that most viewers do not catch it on a normal listen, but once you know to listen for it, you cannot stop hearing it. My own voice describing the tally marks on the wall, and just beneath it, softer, something else describing the exact same thing in the exact same words. I switched to my headlamp and kept working, telling myself it was just equipment failure, and it was maybe 2 minutes later that I heard breathing that was not mine coming from somewhere behind the broken barrels. Slow and deliberate. The kind of breathing a person does when they are trying very hard to be quiet and are failing at it. I called out asking if anyone else was down there, assuming maybe another explorer had followed me in without my noticing. And the breathing stopped completely the moment I spoke, which somehow felt worse than if it had continued. I want to be clear that I did not run immediately, because in my line of hobby, jumping at every strange sound means you never get any footage worth keeping. I moved my headlamp beam across the barrels methodically, the way I always do, and found nothing behind them. No person, no animal, nothing but stone and old wood. It was when I turned back toward the tally marks on the wall to finish my footage that I noticed a new mark had been added, fresh looking against the older weathered scratches, a single line added to what had been a complete group of 5, making it 6, and the stone dust from the scratch was still settling, still drifting down the wall in the beam of my headlamp, meaning it had been made within the last several seconds. Before I left, though, curiosity got the better of my fear the way it usually does in my line of work, and I made myself take one final slow pan of the room with my headlamp before heading for the stairs. In that pan, the beam caught something I had missed entirely on my way in. A low wooden door set into the far wall behind the barrels. A door that should have led nowhere given the cellar's position beneath solid rock. According to the old tannery blueprints I had studied before the trip. The door was slightly ajar, darkness beyond it thicker than it should have been, even for an unlit space. And as I held the light on it, I heard very faintly the sound of something dragging itself across a stone floor on the other side. Slow, heavy, unhurried. The way something moves when it is not concerned about being heard, because it already knows exactly where you are. I did not investigate that door. I did not so much as take a photograph of it. I turned and climbed those stone stairs faster than I've climbed anything in my adult life. And when I returned 8 months later with 2 other explorers, that door was gone entirely. The wall behind the barrels, solid stone with no gap, no hinge marks, nothing to suggest a doorway had ever been there at all, which every one of us checked more than once, because none of us wanted to believe what our own memories were telling us. I left the cellar at a controlled but very fast pace after that, and I want to tell you I have gone back since with better equipment and more people, and that part is true. I did return 8 months later with 2 other explorers and full lighting rigs, and we filmed the whole cellar without incident. Tally marks unchanged from my original footage, no new lines added. What I have never been able to explain is a piece of audio picked up on my second visit's ambient recording. Audio none of us noticed until editing. A voice low, almost affectionate, saying something that sounds like almost got you last time, followed by what my audio engineer described as laughter that did not match any human vocal range he had ever analyzed. After I posted the original cellar footage online, a viewer left a comment that I still think about regularly, from someone claiming their great-grandfather had worked at the Ashford Hollow Tannery as a young man, before losing his position over an accusation of theft he always denied, a dispute that reportedly ended with him being locked in that very cellar overnight by the foreman as a punishment and warning to other workers. An old and brutal practice not unheard of in company towns of that era. The commenter said family stories held that he was never quite the same afterward, prone to counting things obsessively for the rest of his life, tapping out groups of 5 on tabletops without seeming to notice he was doing it, a habit his own children remembered from childhood, without ever understanding where it came from. I have no way to verify that story the way I would verify a historical record, but it lines up with the tally marks closely enough that I have never been able to dismiss it as coincidence. And I still have that comment saved, because something about it feels less like an internet stranger sharing trivia and more like a family finally getting to explain something that never made sense to them. A second commenter, replying to the first, added a detail I found harder to shake. saying an older relative of theirs from the same general area had always warned children never to answer if they heard their own name repeated back to them somewhere quiet and enclosed. A small piece of regional folk wisdom that none of my own research into Appalachian folklore had ever turned up before, and one that lined up uncomfortably well with that second voice trailing just behind my own on the audio track. I returned to Ashford Hollow one more time in 2023 for an anniversary video, above ground only. And while filming near the old foundation, I picked up a faint tapping sound on my audio track again. 5 taps, a pause. 5 more, coming from somewhere beneath the ground I was standing on, patient as ever. Sometimes editing footage from entirely different locations, unrelated towns, states away from Ashford Hollow, I catch myself listening a beat too long to my own narration track, checking for a second voice trailing behind mine, and most of the time there is nothing there, which I tell myself is exactly how it should be, though I have stopped fully trusting that silence the way I used to. My audio engineer, the same one who flagged the laughter on my second Ashford Hollow visit, has since started running every one of my cellar and basement recordings through a secondary noise isolation pass before we publish anything, a habit neither of us discusses out loud, but that has become standard practice on every underground location we film, whether or not the site has any known history to explain why we bother. I have started to think of it less as paranoia and more as a kind of professional courtesy, the same instinct that makes you knock before entering a room, even when you are fairly sure it is empty. Because some places, I have come to believe, deserve that consideration whether or not anyone is technically home. I have built a small reputation online among other urban explorers for being overly cautious compared to some of my peers. Always the one suggesting a second person tag along. Always the one who wants to check the exits twice before going any deeper. And I used to feel a little embarrassed about that reputation before Ashford Hollow. I do not feel embarrassed about it anymore. I've simply started describing it when people ask, is the difference between exploring a ruin and visiting one? And I try now, wherever I go, to remember that I am always the visitor. It has made my channel a little slower to grow than some of my peers, who chase the most dramatic footage without much thought for what they might be disturbing to get it. But it has also meant I have kept doing this work for years longer than most of them. Still walking into dead towns, still filming, still narrating quietly into the dark, because I have learned to ask permission of a place in my own way before I start asking anything of it. I could not tell you exactly what that permission looks like from the outside. A moment of quiet before I switch my camera on. A habit of speaking softly rather than narrating loudly, the way some of my peers do. But I believe, in whatever limited way a person can believe something like this, that it has kept me safer than luck alone would have. And I am not eager to test that theory by changing my approach now. A few newer explorers have started reaching out to me directly after watching the Ashford Hollow footage, asking for advice before their own first solo underground trips. And I always tell them the same thing, which is that equipment and preparation matter. But so does the way you carry yourself into a place that has been forgotten. Because forgotten is not the same thing as empty. And the sooner a person understands that difference, the safer they tend to be out there. I still post that footage. I still go back to towns like Ashford Hollow because the audience wants it, and honestly, some part of me wants it too. But I never go underground alone anymore. Not since that cellar. Not for any amount of good footage. Before we get to a well driller named Silas Boone and what he found underneath a town called Redgrave, if this channel has ever kept you company on a night shift or a long drive, let us know in the comments. And please hit subscribe so you do not miss what is coming. We are just getting started tonight. Story 4. My name is Silas Boone and I drill water wells for a living, mostly residential work across the ridges of Southwest Virginia. Though every so often I get contracted for larger jobs, testing old sites for county records or checking groundwater on land nobody has lived on in decades. In the summer of 2017, the county hired my crew myself, and two other men named Dwight Pruitt and Cole Adkins to test groundwater quality near a former settlement called Redgrave, which had been a small farming and gristmill community until a flood in 1927 wiped out most of the buildings along the creek, and the survivors simply never rebuilt. Redgrave is not much to look at even by ghost town standards. Mostly just a scatter of foundation stones and one stubborn stone chimney that has outlasted everything around it for nearly a century. The county wanted us there because there had been some concern about contamination from an old mill pond leaching into a spring that fed a creek downstream, still used by a couple of farms even now. We set up our rig near where the old mill had stood close to the chimney and started drilling a test bore in the early afternoon. Drilling work is loud and repetitive and does not leave much room for imagination, which is why what happened that day stood out so much, because it happened during a lull, a moment when we had shut the rig down to change out a drill bit and the whole hollow had gone quiet, the way it does in the gap between machine noise and natural sound returning. In that quiet, all three of us heard what sounded like a large number of people talking at once. Not shouting, just the low, overlapping murmur of a crowd, coming from the direction of the creek, maybe 80 yards from where we stood. Dwight, who had grown up in that county and knew its history better than either of us, went pale and said that spot by the creek was where the community used to hold its Sunday services back before the flood, an outdoor gathering place because the town had never gotten around to building a proper church. We walked toward the sound out of a mix of caution and curiosity, the way you do when you cannot quite believe what you are hearing. And as we got closer, the murmuring did not get louder or clearer. It stayed exactly the same volume, no matter how close we walked, which none of us could explain at the time, and none of us can explain now. We reached the creek and found nothing. No people. No evidence anyone had been there recently. Just the water running low over the rocks the way it does in summer. The murmuring stopped the instant we stepped into the clearing, cutting off all at once rather than fading. And Cole, who had said almost nothing the whole time, pointed at the stone chimney behind us and asked in a voice I did not like the sound of whether either of us could see the shape standing next to it. Dwight and I both turned and saw nothing there, and Cole insisted, with real fear in his voice, that a woman in old-fashioned dress was standing beside that chimney, watching all three of us, and had been the entire time we walked to the creek. What none of us mentioned to each other right away, though all three of us admitted it separately over the following weeks, was that each of us had, at some point after the murmuring stopped, felt a hand settle briefly on our shoulder, while we stood in that clearing, a light touch, almost gentle, gone the instant we turned to look. Cole described his as cold enough to feel through his jacket. I described mine as warm, closer to the weight of a hand resting there, out of familiarity than any kind of threat. Dwight would not describe his at all, only saying he did not want to talk about it and changing the subject every time I brought it up afterward, which was unlike him, since Dwight was not a man who typically avoided a topic once you had gotten him started on it. We finished the test bore that day because the county was paying us, and Dwight was not a man who liked to leave a job half done. But none of us went near that chimney again without all three of us standing together. And Cole quit the crew within the month, which he had never given me a full explanation for beyond saying he did not like Redgrave and did not want to talk about it further. Something else happened in the days after that job that I have never fully explained to my own satisfaction. Cole called me about a week later, sounding shaken in a way I had not heard from him before, to tell me he had been having the same dream every night since Redgrave. Always the same woman standing beside a chimney. Except in the dream, she was not simply standing there watching. She was waiting for the water to rise. And every night in the dream, it rose a little higher than the night before, closer to where she stood. And Cole said he woke each time, convinced that whatever happened when the water finally reached her in that dream was something he did not want to be present for. He quit the crew not long after telling me that, And while I have never put much stock in dreams as a rule, I noticed he specifically avoided fieldwork of any kind near water after that, taking only jobs that kept him well clear of creeks and rivers, which was a real limitation in a line of work like ours. Dwight and I still occasionally take jobs in that general county, and every so often, if the work runs late and the light starts going gray the way it did that day, one of us will bring up Redgrave without quite meaning to, and the other will simply nod and suggest we pack up early. An unspoken agreement between two men who do not need to say out loud what they are both thinking about. Neither of us has ever driven past that turnoff after dark since, even when the more direct route would save us the better part of an hour. Dwight keeps that photocopied photograph of Iris Calloway in his truck's glove box now. Not for any practical reason he has ever explained to me, only saying once, gruffly, that it felt wrong to leave her picture sitting in some dusty county archive when nobody else seemed inclined to remember her name. I asked him once, half joking, if he thought carrying it around like that made any difference to her, wherever or whatever she was now, and he did not laugh the way I expected him to, only said that it made a difference to him, and that seemed to be the end of it as far as he was concerned. I have thought about that conversation a great deal since, because Dwight is not a sentimental man by nature. 30 years in drilling work tends to wear that quality down to something harder and more practical. And yet here he is, still carrying a stranger's photograph in his glove box years later, as though some part of him decided that Redgrave was owed at least that much continued attention. And I have never once suggested he stop. Cole, for his part, eventually came back around to drilling work a couple of years later, taking jobs well inland from any major waterway. And the three of us occasionally still end up on the same crew for larger county contracts, though none of us has ever suggested taking a job anywhere near Redgrave again, and the county, as far as I know, has never asked. I sometimes wonder what would happen if a future contract ever did require us to go back out there, whether the three of us would find some polite reason to turn the job down, or whether we would go anyway, older now and maybe a little more prepared for whatever might be waiting. Though I suspect, if I'm honest with myself, that no amount of preparation would make that particular return trip feel like a good idea. The groundwater test came back clean, for what that is worth. No contamination found, which meant the county had no further reason to send anyone back there. And as far as I know, nobody has drilled near that chimney since. Dwight, who I still work with occasionally on smaller jobs, eventually tracked down an old county flood report from 1927 out of pure stubbornness, wanting to know if there was any historical basis for what Cole had described seeing by the chimney. The report listed the dead and missing from the flood, 23 names in total, and among them was a woman named Iris Calloway, remembered in the report only as having refused to leave her house near the mill, even as the water rose, reportedly telling neighbors who tried to help her that she would not abandon a home her husband had built with his own hands, a husband who, according to the same record, had died 2 years earlier in a milling accident. She was never found. Her body was never recovered from the creek, and the report simply lists her as presumed lost. Dwight showed me a photograph reprinted in a later county history book, an old formal portrait of Iris Calloway in a long, dark dress, standing beside that same stone chimney, taken some time before the flood. And I will tell you plainly that it matched close enough to unsettle me the description Cole gave us that day, without ever having seen any such photograph. I have worked construction and drilling jobs in a lot of remote hollows over the years, and most of them are just quiet and empty, nothing more sinister than deer and old fences. Redgrave is the one place I still think about when I'm driving past that turnoff, and I always find a reason to keep driving. If you're enjoying tonight's stories, please take a second to like this video and leave a comment telling us which one has gotten under your skin the most so far. It genuinely helps us know what to bring you next. Up next is a hospice nurse named Nadine Pruitt, and what called her back to a town she thought she had left behind for good. Story 5. My name is Nadine Pruitt, and I have worked as a hospice nurse in rural Tennessee for almost 15 years, which means most of my job involves driving long distances to sit with people in the last weeks and days of their lives, out in hollows and hilltops that most medical staff will not drive to after dark. I grew up in a small community outside a town called Millstone Junction, which itself sits about 6 miles from what used to be an actual settlement of the same era, a smaller mining offshoot called Cinder Hollow that emptied out entirely by the early 1960s, after the seam it depended on played out. I had not thought about Cinder Hollow in years until a hospice case brought me back to that exact stretch of road in the winter of 2022. My patient was an elderly woman named Opal Deaton, who lived alone in a farmhouse near the old Cinder Hollow turnoff, dying slowly of heart failure, cared for mostly by a niece who worked days and needed someone to check on Opal in the evenings. I took the case because it was close to where I grew up, and because something about caring for the dying in the place I was raised felt like it mattered to me more than the other cases on my rotation. Opal was a difficult patient, in the way a lot of proud elderly mountain women are difficult, sharp-tongued, suspicious of help. But she warmed to me over the weeks, partly because I knew the area, and partly, I think, because she was lonely in a way medicine cannot treat. It was on one of my evening visits, maybe 5 weeks into the case, that Opal grabbed my wrist harder than her weakened grip should have allowed, and told me, with a clarity that had been missing from most of our recent conversations, that I needed to go check on the hollow, because they were calling for me again. I asked her what she meant, thinking it was confusion, common enough in patients that close to the end. But she insisted, telling me that her own mother had grown up in Cinder Hollow before the town emptied, and that the women of that family had always been the ones who could hear it when the town wanted somebody, and that I had that same blood in me whether I wanted it or not, because Opal and my grandmother had been cousins, something I had genuinely never known. I did not think much of it as anything beyond a dying woman's confusion, and I finished my visit and drove home that night the normal way, which does not pass anywhere near the Cinder Hollow turnoff. But 3 nights later, driving home from a different patient's house well after midnight, I found myself, without any clear decision to do so, turning onto the old logging road that leads up towards Cinder Hollow, a road I had not driven since I was a teenager. I want to be honest that I do not fully understand why I made that turn. It did not feel like curiosity. It felt closer to the way your body responds to a phone ringing, an automatic reach towards something demanding your attention. The road dead ends about a quarter mile from where the town used to stand. And I parked there and again, without a clear decision behind it, got out and walked the rest of the way in on foot in December at nearly 1 a.m, wearing scrubs and a light jacket, which, even as I'm telling you this, sounds like the actions of someone who was not entirely in control of herself. Cinder Hollow by then was almost nothing. A few collapsed foundations under snow, one leaning telephone pole with no wires left on it. I stood in the middle of what would have been the main road through town, and I heard, clear across the frozen quiet, a baby crying, the specific desperate cry of a newborn, coming from somewhere among the collapsed foundations. I am a nurse. I have delivered babies and I have held dying infants. And I know that sound in a way most people do not. And every instinct in my body told me it was real, and it was close, and it needed help. I moved toward the sound, and it seemed to move too, always coming from the next foundation over, then the next, leading me steadily further from the road and deeper into the ruins. And it was only when I stumbled into what had clearly once been a small family cemetery, 6 or 7 sunken graves marked with plain field stones, that the crying stopped entirely, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Standing at the edge of that cemetery, I felt, rather than heard, a kind of pressure settle around me, like the air itself had gotten heavier, and a woman's voice, very close to my ear though nothing was there, said, "Thank you for coming. We knew you would," in a tone of such genuine warmth that it frightened me more than any threat could have. There is a gap in my memory between standing at the edge of that cemetery and finding myself back at my car that I have never been able to close, no matter how many times I've tried to walk myself through it in my own head since. What I do remember, in fragments that do not connect cleanly to one another, is the feeling of being led rather than walking on my own, a gentle, steady pressure at my back, guiding me the way you might guide a small child through a crowd. And at one point, clear as anything, the sensation of a small, cold hand slipping into mine for the length of maybe 10 steps before letting go. I remember thinking in that fragment that I should not let go first, and I do not know whether I did or whether it simply released me on its own once we reached wherever it meant to take me. I do not remember walking back to my car. I remember being in it, engine running, hands too cold to properly grip the wheel, with no memory of the walk between the cemetery and the road. In the days between that night at Cinder Hollow and Opal's passing, I visited her twice more, and on the second of those visits, with her niece out of the room getting supplies from the car, Opal took my hand again, weaker this time, and told me, without my having said a single word to her about what happened, that I had gone, and that she was glad because it meant she could finally rest easy about it. The way her own mother had once told her, she could rest easy after her turn came and went decades before. I asked her what exactly it was that called people back like that, and she only shook her head slightly and said, some things are better carried than explained, and that I would understand her meaning someday, when it was my turn to explain it to somebody else. I've thought about that exchange more than almost anything else in my nursing career, and I still do not fully understand it, though I no longer feel afraid when I think about it. Only a strange kind of resigned patience. The same patience I imagine Opal carried with her for most of her life. Opal Deaton died 4 nights later, peacefully in her sleep, with her niece beside her. I never told her about what happened at Cinder Hollow, and I have never gone back, though I still drive past that turnoff every week on my rotation. And some nights, only some nights, I could swear I hear something small and far off crying just as I pass it. And I keep both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road until the sound is well behind me. After Opal's funeral, I finally worked up the nerve to ask her niece, a woman named Teresa, whether Opal had ever talked about Cinder Hollow while Teresa was growing up. Teresa said her aunt rarely spoke of it directly, but had once mentioned offhand that there had been a difficult winter birth in the hollow sometime before the mine closed. A baby who did not survive its first night despite the whole small community gathering to try to help, and that the loss had apparently hit the town so hard that some families cited it, alongside the failing mine, as part of why they finally left for good, as though the place itself had become too sad to keep living in. Teresa also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that several women in our extended family going back generations had described similar experiences to what Opal had warned me about. A pull toward that stretch of road late at night that they described not as fear but as obligation, and that most of them, like Opal, had simply learned to expect it and let it pass rather than fighting it. I still do not fully understand what happened to me that December night, and I have not felt that same pull since, though I notice I have started keeping a blanket and a full tank of gas in my car at all times now, a habit I never had before, one I have not examined too closely because I am not sure I want the answer. I also find myself, without deciding to, checking in on the younger women in my extended family a little more closely than I used to, asking careful questions about strange nights or unexplainable urges, not wanting to alarm anyone, but wanting, I think, it to be the kind of relative Opal was to me if the time ever comes for one of them the way it came for me. I want to add one more thing before moving on, something Teresa mentioned almost in passing, that I have never been able to set down entirely. She said that in the week after Opal's funeral, while going through her aunt's belongings, she found an old, undated photograph tucked into a Bible, a formal portrait of a group of Cinder Hollow residents, standing together outside what was likely the town's general store, faces solemn the way old photographs tend to be. Standing at the edge of that group, slightly apart from the others, was a young woman Teresa did not recognize from any family record. And when she showed the photograph to me, I felt a chill I could not immediately explain, because something about the set of that woman's shoulders and the tilt of her head matched, closely enough to unsettle me. The presence I had felt walking beside me that December night. Teresa let me keep a copy of that photograph, and it sits now in a drawer at my house that I do not open often. I have shown it exactly once to another nurse on my rotation, an older woman who has worked hospice even longer than I have, and she looked at it for a long moment before telling me quietly that she had seen a face very much like that one before too, in a photograph belonging to a different patient's family, in a different county entirely, which either means these mountains hold more than their share of resembling strangers, or something else I am not sure I am ready to sit with for very long. I have not asked her the county where her own patient's photograph came from, and some part of me suspects I never will, because there is a difference between wanting to understand something and wanting to keep being able to fall asleep at night. And I have decided for now to protect the second thing a little more carefully than the first. What I can say, without needing any further confirmation from anyone, is that hospice work has changed for me since that winter. Less like a job I clock into and more like a kind of ongoing conversation with something patient and larger than any single patient I sit beside. And I have made a quiet kind of peace with not fully understanding my place in that conversation, so long as I keep showing up for it. I have started in a small way, keeping my own version of what Opal called carrying rather than explaining, a private habit of writing down, after certain difficult cases, small, unexplainable details I notice, and do not share with coworkers. Not because I think anyone would disbelieve me, but because some things, I have come to understand, are meant to be kept rather than spread thin across casual conversation. I do not know how many pages that private notebook will eventually fill, but I know I will keep adding to it for as long as I keep doing this work. Because some part of caring for the dying, I have come to believe, means being willing to carry a few things you cannot fully explain quietly for as long as it takes. If tonight's stories have been keeping you up, that is exactly the goal. So make sure you like this video before you go and subscribe so these accounts keep finding their way to you. Coming up next, a drone surveyor named Corbin Lasky discovers something no county map ever accounted for in a town called Whitmore Bend. Story 6. My name is Corbin Lasky, and I run a small aerial survey business out of eastern Tennessee, contracting mostly with county governments and timber companies who need drone mapping of land that is too steep or too overgrown for a ground crew to survey efficiently. It is precise, unglamorous work most of the time. Flight paths programmed into software, elevation data collected in neat rows, nothing that should ever feel personal. In the spring of 2023, I was hired by a county historical commission to produce a full aerial survey of a former settlement called Whitmore Bend, tucked into a horseshoe curve of a river in the mountains. Abandoned since a series of floods in the 1940s made the low ground permanently unfit to live on. The commission wanted the survey to help document remaining foundations before the site was potentially opened as a low-key historical trail. And the job seemed simple enough on paper. Fly a grid pattern, capture high-resolution imagery and elevation data, stitch it together back at the office. I drove out early on a clear April morning, set up my ground station at the edge of what used to be the town square, and began flying the first of what would be about a dozen planned passes over the site. The first several passes went exactly as expected. Clean imagery of overgrown foundations, a scatter of rusted farm equipment, the outline of what had probably been a small general store. It was on the fifth pass, flying a section along the river bend, where the flooding would have hit hardest, that I noticed something in the live feed that did not match anything I could see on the ground from my position at the station, In the footage, moving along what had clearly once been a residential street, was a line of small figures walking single file, evenly spaced, moving at a steady pace in the direction of the river. I counted 11 of them in the frame before the drone passed beyond that section of the grid. I looked up immediately from the controller screen to the actual street below, visible to me from where I stood, and there was nothing there. No people, no movement of any kind, just weeds and broken foundation stone under the morning sun. I assumed, reasonably I thought, that it was some kind of sensor artifact or a reflection issue with the camera. Drones can produce strange visual glitches under certain lighting, and I continued the survey, making a mental note to review the footage more carefully later. By the 8th pass, I had mostly convinced myself it had been nothing, until the live feed showed the same line of figures again, in the exact same location, moving in the exact same direction, at the exact same pace, which is not how a lighting artifact behaves. Artifacts do not repeat themselves as a consistent, coherent group performing the same action twice. I brought the drone down for a manual low pass directly over that section of street, flying it slow and close to get the clearest possible footage. And on that pass, the feed showed the figures had stopped moving entirely and were standing still, all 11 of them, facing upward, toward the drone, toward me, which is when I lost the video feed completely, the screen going to static for nearly 10 full seconds before resolving back to a normal, empty view of the overgrown street. After the static cleared on that low pass, before I brought the drone back to the station, I flew one more careful loop over the exact section of street where the figures had stood, and the live feed, still functioning normally by then, showed something I have never included in any of my public presentations of that footage, because I'm still not sure how to talk about it responsibly. Scattered across the overgrown street below, arranged in a loose cluster that had not been there on any of the earlier passes, were what looked like 11 small, pale shapes lying flat against the ground, roughly the size and proportion of children, gone the moment I brought the drone down lower for a clearer look. The street beneath showing nothing but weeds and broken stone by the time the aircraft was 30 feet up. I've gone back and forth for years about whether what I saw in that brief high-altitude glimpse was a genuine last visible echo of something, or simply my own mind, primed by everything that had already happened that morning, finding shapes in patches of shadow and old debris. I'm not sure it matters which explanation is true. Either way, it is not something I have been able to unsee. I finished the survey that day because I am, admittedly, a stubborn person, and because I told myself repeatedly that equipment glitches happen, and I was not going to let one spook me off a paying job. But I did not review that footage closely again until I was back home that night. And when I finally sat down and went frame by frame through the 5th and 8th pass recordings, the figures were gone. Not blurred, not distorted, simply absent. The footage showing nothing but an empty, overgrown street in both passes, exactly like the 7 other passes that had never shown anything unusual. The only anomaly left in the recording was those 10 seconds of static during the low pass, time-stamped and undeniable, sitting in otherwise perfectly clean, high-resolution footage. Before making that call, I spent the better part of an evening pulling apart the elevation data my software had generated from the day's flight, mostly out of professional habit, wanting to see if the ground-penetrating portion of the survey showed anything unusual beneath that section of street. It did, buried at a shallow depth just off the old roadbed, close enough to where the figures had appeared to walk. The data showed a series of small, linear anomalies, consistent with disturbed soil, roughly the right size and spacing to be unmarked graves. Information the Historical Commission had never mentioned to me, and, as I would later learn from Beverly, had not actually known about themselves until my survey brought it to their attention, a discovery that led to a respectful and quiet excavation review the following year, conducted by county archaeologists rather than treasure hunters, out of respect for whoever might still be resting there. I called the county historian I had been working with, a woman named Beverly Coates, who had spent decades researching Whitmore Bend, and asked her carefully if she knew anything about a group of 11 people connected to the town's history. She went quiet on the phone for a long moment before telling me that local records showed 11 residents, mostly children and 2 adults who had stayed behind to help them, had drowned trying to cross the swollen river during the worst of the 1940s flooding in an attempt to reach higher ground on the far bank, a crossing that had failed less than 100 yards from where my drone had captured that line of figures, walking the same direction they had died walking. The Historical Commission still opened the trail 18 months later, with a small plaque near the river bend commemorating the flood victims. Information I understand came partly from my own account of that day, though the plaque itself makes no mention of drones or figures or static-filled footage, only names and a date. I have flown dozens of survey jobs since Whitmore Bend, plenty of them over other abandoned places, and I have never seen anything like it again, which is either a comfort or the opposite of one depending on the day you ask me. I still keep that raw footage backed up in 3 separate places, and I have shown it to exactly 4 people in my life, and every one of them has gone quiet in the same way Beverly did on that phone call. Beverly Coates, the county historian, called me back about a week after our initial conversation, saying she had gone digging further into old church and county records and found something that had stuck with her since we spoke. Among the 11 flood victims, 10 had been children between the ages of 4 and 13 from a single church group, out on what should have been a short supervised walk along the riverbank when the water rose faster than anyone anticipated. And the 11th victim was a young Sunday school teacher, barely 20 years old herself, who, according to survivor testimony, collected shortly after the flood, had refused to let go of the smallest child in the group, even as the current took them both, choosing in the final moments available to her not to save herself alone. Beverly told me the survivor accounts described the group trying to reach higher ground by walking in a specific order, oldest and strongest at front and back, youngest protected in the middle, single file along the safest visible path, which matched with a precision that still unsettles me the exact walking formation my drone captured that morning. 11 figures in careful order moving toward a river that had killed them the better part of a century earlier. Beverly also sent me, some weeks later, a scanned copy of a newspaper clipping from just after the flood, listing the young Sunday school teacher's name as Alma Ruth Denning, along with a short note from her surviving family thanking the community for search efforts, even though no bodies beyond a few of the children were ever recovered from that stretch of river. I have never told Beverly this directly, but the 11th figure in my drone footage, the one at the rear of the line, was noticeably taller than the others, walking in the exact protective position a young adult would take up behind a group of children she refused to leave behind. I keep a still frame from that footage saved on my phone, cropped tightly on that final figure, and there are nights working late on other survey jobs when I find myself pulling it up without quite meaning to, just to look at her a while. I have since flown surveys over 3 other flood air sites in that same river system, always half expecting, half hoping to see that same careful line of figures again. And I have not, which I've come to understand as its own kind of answer, though I could not tell you exactly what question it is answering. What I can tell you is that I fly every job differently now than I did before Whitmore Bend, slower, more deliberate, and I always take a moment before packing up to hover the drone briefly over whatever section of ground I have been documenting, not for any additional data, but simply as a kind of acknowledgement, a small pause before leaving, in case anyone down there is keeping track of who comes and who bothers to look twice. It is a small habit, and I doubt it changes anything about the data I collect or the reports I file for the county, but it has changed something in how I do this work. turning what used to be a purely technical job into something that feels, at least to me, a little closer to standing witness. And I do not think I would trade that feeling away even if I could. Beverly and I still stay in touch, mostly professionally, but every year around the anniversary of the flood, she sends me a short message. Nothing elaborate, just a note letting me know the plaque is still standing and the trail is still respectfully maintained. And every year I write back the same simple reply, "Thank you for remembering them," which feels like the smallest and most necessary thing either of us can offer at this point. I think about that exchange every time I fly a new job now. A brief moment of gratitude passed back and forth between two people who never expected a piece of survey equipment to turn into something closer to an act of remembrance. And I have come to think that is not a bad way for this line of work to occasionally surprise you. I have since recommended quietly to two other surveyors I trained that they always take a moment at the end of a flood site survey to simply sit with what the data shows before packing up and moving to the next job. Not because it changes the numbers in any measurable way, but because I believe now more than I ever did before Whitmore Bend, that the work we do out over these old places is not purely technical, no matter how much the software and the equipment might suggest otherwise. There is something particular about watching a tragedy repeat itself from 200 feet in the air, removed enough to feel safe and close enough to know you are not. I think about those 11 people more than I think about almost anyone else I have never met. If this story got to you the way it got to me, please take a moment to like the video. And if you have not already subscribed, now is a good time, because we have one more account tonight that I promise will stay with you. A church restoration contractor named Wanda Prescott found something waiting for her inside the last standing building in a town called Sorrow's Landing, and it is where we are headed next. Story 7. My name is Wanda Prescott, and I run a small restoration company in western North Carolina that specializes in historic churches, the kind of work that involves a lot of careful masonry repair, roof stabilization, and matching old growth lumber to structures nobody makes replacement parts for anymore. Most of my jobs come from active congregations trying to save buildings older than any of their members. But every so often the work takes me somewhere with no congregation left at all. Just a building the county or a historical trust once preserved as a landmark. That was the case in the fall of 2020, when a preservation trust hired my crew to stabilize the one structure still standing in a settlement called Sorrow's Landing, a small church that had somehow survived nearly a century after the rest of the town around it had been abandoned. Sorrow's Landing had been a river town, built around a ferry crossing and a small logging operation, and it emptied out gradually rather than all at once, families leaving one by one over the course of decades, as the ferry business dried up and the logging moved elsewhere, until by the 1970s, the only building left with any real use to anyone was the church, a plain white clapboard structure that a scattered handful of descendants still return to twice a year for homecoming services, even after the last full-time resident had moved away. By the time I got the contract, even those homecoming services had stopped, the last elderly member of the old congregation having passed away 3 years prior, and the trust wanted the building preserved as a historical site before it fell into disrepair the way the rest of the town already had. I brought a crew of 3, myself and 2 men I had worked with for years, Gareth Holt and a younger carpenter named Denny Okafor, and we set up to begin roof and foundation work in early October. The church itself was in rougher shape than the trust's paperwork had suggested. Water damage along the north wall, several rotted floor joists, but nothing outside the range of normal restoration work. What was unusual from the very first day was the pew arrangement inside. Someone, and there was no record of who or when, had rearranged the pews from their original forward-facing configuration into a circle in the center of the sanctuary, all facing inward, as though set up for a gathering that had nothing to do with the traditional service. Gareth, who had done restoration work in that region for over 30 years, told me he had seen that kind of pew arrangement exactly one other time, in a different abandoned church, and that old-timers in these hollows sometimes called it a calling circle, a folk practice from well before his own time that involved arranging seating so that whatever was being invited to attend would have a clear place among the living, rather than simply watching from outside. He said it half-joking, the way people do when they want to mention something uncomfortable without fully committing to believing it. And we moved the pews back to their original positions before starting work, mostly because a circular arrangement would have gotten in the way of the floor repair. Work went normally for the first week and a half. It was on a Thursday afternoon with Gareth and Denny up on the roof, and myself working alone inside on the floor joists beneath the sanctuary, that I first noticed the pews had been moved again, back into that same circle, despite the fact that no one had been in the building besides the three of us, and both other men had been on the roof the entire morning, where I could hear them working directly above me. I called up to ask if either of them had come down and rearranged the furniture as some kind of joke, and both said no, sounding as confused by the question as I was by the pews. I did not think much more of it that day, assuming perhaps a local visitor had come through and moved things without our noticing, unlikely as that seemed given how remote the site was. But the pews moved again the following week, and again the week after that, always into that same circular arrangement, always when none of us had witnessed it happening, no matter how carefully we tried to keep watch. Before Denny set up that camera, we tried a simpler test first, one that Gareth suggested half seriously, which was to sprinkle a fine layer of sawdust across the floor around the pews at the end of a workday, thinking that if something physical was moving them, even something we could not see, it would leave drag marks or footprints in the dust by morning. When we arrived the next day and found the pews once again rearranged into their circle, the sawdust beneath and around them showed no drag marks at all, no footprints, nothing to indicate the pews had been physically dragged across the floor in the way ordinary furniture would leave evidence of being moved. And yet they were undeniably in a different position than where we had left them, resting as neatly and precisely as if they had simply always been arranged that way. Which is when Gareth stopped joking about the calling circle and started treating the whole situation with a seriousness I had not seen from him on any job before or since. Denny, the youngest of us, and the least inclined towards superstition, eventually set up a trail camera aimed at the sanctuary overnight, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was responsible. And when we reviewed the footage the following morning, we found nothing helpful in the traditional sense. The footage showed the pews in their proper, forward-facing rows at midnight, and showed them in a full circle at 4 a.m, with no visible movement in between. The transition simply happening in the gap between two consecutive frames, an impossible jump with no explanation the camera could offer us. It was near the end of that same week, working late to finish the floor repair before an early frost made outdoor work impossible, that I stayed behind alone after Gareth and Denny had already left for the evening, wanting to finish sealing the last section of subfloor before dark. I was kneeling near the center of the sanctuary, exactly where the circle of pews always ended up forming, when I felt the temperature in the room drop sharply enough that I could see my breath and heard distinctly the creak and scrape of wooden pews being dragged across the floor around me. Though nothing was visibly moving, I stayed perfectly still, telling myself it was settling wood or some trick of the cold, until I heard voices layered over the scraping sound, several of them, low, overlapping, singing what I recognized after a moment as an old hymn, the kind sung without instruments, the kind my own grandmother used to sing in churches not unlike this one. I am not a woman who scares easily, and I want that understood, because what I did next was not born out of panic, but out of something closer to reverence. The same instinct that makes you lower your voice in a room where someone is grieving. I stayed kneeling on that floor and let the singing continue around me, unseen voices filling a room that had not held a living congregation in years, until it faded on its own after what felt like several minutes, and the temperature slowly returned to normal, and I was alone again in an empty church, with pews arranged in their proper forward-facing rows, exactly as I had left them that morning. Before that Thursday night ended, I want to add one more detail I have generally left out of how I tell this story, because it is the part that stayed with me longest. When the singing finally faded and the room warmed back to normal, I noticed, sitting on the subfloor directly in front of where I knelt, a single hymnal closed, its cover far less weathered than anything else left behind in that building, as though it had been recently handled rather than sitting untouched for years, like everything else in the sanctuary. I picked it up and it fell open on its own to a specific page, a hymn I did not recognize by title, and pressed between those pages was a pressed wildflower, dried but not disintegrated, the kind of thing a person tucks into a book to save a small private moment. I left that hymnal exactly where I found it, closed on the altar rail. And when Gareth and Denny returned the following morning, none of us could find it again anywhere in the building, though all three of us searched, and neither of them had touched it or moved it in the time between. We finished the restoration that winter, and the trust held a small rededication ceremony the following spring, inviting whatever descendants of the old congregation could still be located. I attended that ceremony, and standing in the back of a sanctuary full of folding chairs set up in traditional rows, I watched an elderly woman, one of the last living descendants of Sorrow's Landing's original families, walk straight to the center of the room, look around at the arrangement, and ask, without any explanation from anyone, why nobody had thought to set the chairs in a circle, the way the old congregation always used to do it for homecoming, because that was how they liked to be gathered. Nobody in that room had told her about the pews. Nobody had told her anything about what my crew and I experienced that fall. After the ceremony, I asked that elderly woman, whose name was Louise Tanner, what she remembered about the circle arrangement, and she told me it went back further than anyone still living could properly account for. A custom her own grandmother had described as older than the church building itself, brought over from a much smaller log chapel that had stood on the same ground before the current structure was built in the 1890s. Louise said the circle was meant to make sure nobody in the congregation, living or otherwise, ever had their back turned to another, a practice she understood to have started after some kind of loss so old that even her grandmother had only ever spoken of it in vague terms, something involving a sickness that swept through the original settlement and took most of one family within a single season. Louise also told me quietly, near the end of our conversation, that she had attended homecoming at that church every single year of her life until it stopped being held, and that in all those years, she had never once felt alone in that sanctuary, even when the pews around her were empty, and she did not expect that feeling had changed just because the services had. Before she left the rededication ceremony that day, Louise took my hand and thanked me specifically, not for the roof or the floor joists, but for whatever it was I had done that convinced them, her word, to finally let the building rest properly again. And when I asked her what she meant by that, she only smiled and said, "Some jobs finish themselves once the right person shows up to do them," which is not an explanation I have ever fully understood, but one I have carried with me into every restoration project since. Gareth retired the following year, and Denny now runs his own small crew, and the two of us still trade calls every few months. And Sorrow's Landing always comes up eventually, spoken of gently, the way you speak about a strange relative you nonetheless remember with real fondness. I have taken on 2 other historic church jobs since, and on both of them, without telling either client why, I have quietly suggested arranging the seating in a loose circle for at least the dedication service. And both times, without any prompting from me, an older member of the congregation has thanked me for the idea, saying it felt like the right way to gather, though neither of them could have explained why any better than I could myself. I do not know what to call whatever it is that lives on in a building like that, long after its congregation has scattered or passed on. Whether it is memory or habit or something closer to a promise kept past the point anyone remembers making it. But I have stopped needing a word for it, and I have started simply making room for it, wherever my work happens to take me next. That shift in thinking has made me, if anything, better at this job than I was before, more patient with old buildings, more willing to listen to what a structure seems to be telling me before I start tearing into it with tools. And more than one client since has commented, without knowing why, that my restorations feel less like renovations and more like the building simply being allowed to keep going the way it always meant to. I do not correct them when they say that. I simply thank them, and I think quietly of a circle of pews in an empty sanctuary, and a hymnal that opened itself to exactly the right page. And I get back to work. There are worse things, I have decided, than spending a career surrounded by buildings that remember more than they should, and worse ways to make a living than helping them keep standing a little longer, for whoever or whatever still finds their way back to sit in those pews when nobody living is watching. I have restored a great many old churches since Sorrow's Landing, and I have never again encountered anything quite like it, though I will admit that in every sanctuary I work in now, empty or not, I find myself listening a little more carefully than I used to, for the sound of voices that should not be there. If you thought that was the last of tonight's accounts, we are not finished yet. Stick around, because a game warden named Emmett Ryland is about to tell you what he found while tracking a poacher into a town called Millhaven, and it only gets stranger from here. Story 8. My name is Emmett Ryland, and I've worked as a state game warden in the mountains of eastern Tennessee for almost 19 years, which means my job takes me into places most people never set foot in. Following poachers, tracking wounded game, checking on illegal camps tucked into hollows. The county has long since stopped patrolling. In November of 2018, I got called out after a landowner reported hearing gunshots on posted land near an old settlement called Millhaven, a former tannery and trading post town that had emptied out sometime in the 1950s after the river that once floated goods downstream silted up beyond any use. I tracked a set of boot prints and a blood trail from a wounded deer well past the property line and into what remained of Millhaven itself, a scatter of collapsed log structures along a dry creek bed, most of them reduced to little more than stone chimneys and rotted sill logs after 70 years of neglect. The light was already going by the time I reached the edge of the old town, and I made the call, the way I have made 100 times before in similar situations, to keep tracking rather than turn back, since a wounded animal left overnight rarely survives regardless. And a warden's job includes making sure a kill does not go to waste, even when the hunter responsible has broken the law to make it. The blood trail led me directly toward the largest structure still standing, what would have been the trading post itself, judging by its size and the remains of a collapsed loading dock along one side. I want to explain something about tracking blood in low light, because it requires a kind of narrow, total focus, eyes fixed on the ground, everything else fading into peripheral awareness, which is likely why I did not notice right away that the temperature around me had dropped several degrees colder than the rest of the evening air. Colder in a way that had nothing to do with the setting sun. I looked up from the trail only once I reached the trading post's open doorway and found the blood trail ending abruptly at the threshold. No deer, no carcass, nothing beyond that point but an undisturbed floor of old leaves and collapsed shelving, as though whatever had been bleeding had simply stopped existing the moment it crossed into the building. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, flashlight raised, and it was in that stillness that I heard, from somewhere deeper inside the structure, the unmistakable sound of goods being weighed and counted, the specific rhythmic clink of coins or weights being set down one after another onto a hard surface, a sound with no earthly business coming from a building that had not held functioning commerce in nearly 7 decades. I've spent almost 2 decades working alone in remote country. And one thing that job teaches you is a very specific kind of controlled fear, the kind that lets you keep functioning, even while every instinct in your body is telling you to leave. I stepped inside, flashlight sweeping the room, and found it exactly as empty as it should have been. No coins, no scale, no evidence that the sound I had just heard had any physical source at all. It was on my second sweep of the room that my light caught, sitting undisturbed on what remained of a collapsed counter, an old brass trade scale, tarnished nearly black with age but fully intact, its panes hanging level and motionless, though I would have sworn on anything that no such object had been sitting there 30 seconds earlier when my light first passed over that same spot. I did not touch that scale. I backed out of the trading post the way I had come in, radioed my position to dispatch out of habit more than necessity, and made the decision, one of the few times in 19 years I have made this particular call, to leave a wounded animal untracked overnight, rather than push any further into that building. I filed the poaching report the next morning and let a colleague follow up on the physical investigation, and I have never gone back into Millhaven since, though I still patrol the boundary line around it regularly. And every so often on cold, still evenings, I could swear I still hear that same faint clink of a scale being weighed, carried out from somewhere inside those ruined walls. I've spent almost 2 decades in this line of work, learning to read the woods, tracking, weather, animal behavior, all of it. And Millhaven remains the one place I have never been able to read at all. If tonight's accounts have kept you good company, take a second to like this video, and let us know in the comments if you have ever worked a job that took you somewhere you were not meant to be. Next, a large animal veterinarian named Corinne Falk gets called out to a herd of frozen, terrified cattle near a place called Grissom's Ferry. And what she finds there will make you think twice about answering an emergency call after dark. Story 9. My name is Corinne Falk, and I have spent the last 11 years working as a large animal veterinarian across the ridges of southwestern Virginia. Most of that time doing farm calls that take me down back roads. Most GPS systems refuse to properly map. In February of 2022, I got an emergency call from a farmer whose cattle had broken through a weak section of fence line and wandered onto an old abandoned property near a settlement called Grissom's Ferry, a former riverboat landing and trading community that had been swallowed by forest after the ferry crossing shut down for good in the early 1960s, when a new bridge made it obsolete a few miles downstream. I drove out well after dark, following the farmer's directions along a logging road that eventually gave way to what had once been Grissom's Ferry's main street, now barely visible under decades of undergrowth. The farmer, a heavyset man named Roy Tackett, met me at the edge of the property with a flashlight and an anxious expression, explaining that 3 of his heifers had wandered into the ruins and would not come back out no matter how he called or coaxed, standing frozen in place near what remained of an old warehouse close to the riverbank. I found the cattle exactly where Roy described, 3 heifers standing rigid and trembling in a tight cluster, refusing to move despite every normal method Roy and I both knew for moving spooked livestock. In nearly 11 years of practice, I had never seen animals behave quite that way. Not fear exactly, more like a kind of frozen deference. Heads lowered, utterly still except for the visible tremor running through their flanks. I approached slowly, running a hand along the nearest heifer's side to check her over physically. And it was while I stood there, my hand still resting on that animal, that I heard from the direction of the old warehouse the unmistakable creak of a large door swinging open on rusted hinges, though the warehouse itself had no door left standing that either Roy or I could see with our flashlights. Roy went very quiet beside me, and when I asked him what was wrong, he told me in a lowered voice that his own grandfather used to tell a story about Grissom's Ferry, Something about a warehouse fire that trapped a group of dock workers, loading a late shipment sometime around the turn of the century. Men who had been locked in by a foreman, eager to make a deadline, and did not get the doors open again before the smoke overtook them. Roy said the story always ended the same way, that on certain still nights, you could still hear that warehouse door swinging open, as though something inside were finally, endlessly, trying to let itself out. Roy said the story always ended the same way, that on certain still nights, you could still hear that warehouse door swinging open, as though something inside were finally, endlessly, trying to let itself out. The heifers finally allowed themselves to be let out about 20 minutes later, all at once, as though released from whatever had been holding them in place, and Roy and I walked them back to the fence line, without another word between us, both of us listening for that door the entire way. I checked those 3 heifers over thoroughly once we got them back to the barn and found nothing physically wrong with any of them. No injury, no illness, nothing a vet visit would normally document. And I still noted the call in my records, exactly the way I noted every other emergency visit that year. Because that is the job, even on nights when the job does not make any sense at all. Roy called me a few months later, not about his cattle, but simply to tell me he had done some digging of his own through old county fire records and found a brief mention of a warehouse fire at Grissom's Ferry in 1911 that matched his grandfather's story closely enough to unsettle him all over again. 4 dock workers listed among the dead, their names recorded with almost clinical brevity in a report otherwise focused entirely on property damage and insurance claims. I have taken emergency calls near a lot of remote properties since that night, and I have learned to trust an animal's fear a great deal more than I used to, because whatever those heifers sensed standing near that warehouse, I am fairly certain it was not confusion. If you have ever watched an animal refuse to go somewhere for no reason you could explain, drop a comment and tell us about it, because animals seem to notice these places long before we ever do. Coming up next, a timber cruiser named Holt Bramwell spends a long, dark night alone near an old logging camp called Pryor's Gap, listening to someone who should not still be working. Story 10. My name is Holt Bramwell and I work as a timber cruiser, which means I spend most of my working life walking through forest land, assessing tree stands for logging companies, estimating board footage, marking boundaries, the kind of solitary outdoor work that takes me into some of the most remote corners of the Appalachians for days at a stretch. In late September of 2019, I was contracted to survey a large parcel in West Virginia that included the site of a long abandoned settlement called Pryor's Gap, a small logging camp itself, ironically enough, that had operated in the early 1900s, before the surrounding timber was exhausted and the whole operation folded within a single decade. I set up a small camp of my own near the edge of Pryor's Gap on my second night out, planning to survey the last section of the parcel the following morning before hiking back to my truck. The ruins of the old camp sat maybe 200 yards from my tent, visible as a scatter of collapsed structures through the trees, and I did not think much of proximity to it until well after dark, lying in my sleeping bag, when I began hearing what sounded unmistakably like the rhythmic thud of an axe biting into wood, coming from somewhere within those ruins, steady and unhurried, the specific sound of someone working through a long night shift, rather than a quick job. I told myself it was likely another hunter or hiker camped nearby, though the parcel was posted and I'd seen no other vehicles at the access point that day. The sound continued for what felt like a long while, punctuated by brief pauses exactly the length a man might take to reposition a log or wipe sweat from his brow. And it was during one of those pauses that I heard, clear across the dark distance between my tent and the ruins, a man's voice counting aloud, slow and deliberate, reaching numbers well past what any reasonable tally of firewood would require, as though he were counting something else entirely and simply using the axe strikes to keep his place. I did not sleep well that night, and in the gray light of early morning, curiosity got the better of caution, and I walked over to the ruins to see what I could find. What I found was nothing. No axe, no wood, no fire pit, no sign that anyone had been there in longer than I could reasonably estimate. Only, near the center of the camp, a single fresh wood chip resting on top of decades of undisturbed leaf litter, pale and clean cut, as though it had been split from a log only hours before. I picked that chip up without thinking, turned it over in my hand, and set it back down exactly where I found it. Some instinct telling me it was not mine to keep. And I finished my survey that morning faster than I had planned, moving through the remaining boundary lines with considerably less patience for detail than I normally bring to the job. I mentioned what I had heard to the logging company's forestry manager when I turned in my report, mostly expecting him to laugh it off. And instead he told me, somewhat reluctantly, that Pryor's Gap had a reputation among older crews in that county. Something about a camp foreman decades back who kept his men working brutal overnight shifts to hit an impossible production quota, driving at least 2 workers to exhaustion-related deaths before the whole operation folded under financial strain shortly after. He said newer crews were generally steered toward other parcels when the company had a choice in the matter, not out of any official policy, just an accumulated habit of avoidance nobody had ever bothered to formally explain. I still take timber cruising jobs across that region regularly, and I've learned to check, quietly, before accepting any new contract, whether the parcel includes ground anyone might call reluctant to work, a phrase I did not fully understand the meaning of until that night near Pryor's Gap. Let us know in the comments if you have ever heard something working in the woods that had no business still being on the clock. Next, a rural mail carrier named Priscilla Vance hears a rhythm coming from a dead foundry that should have gone quiet decades ago at a place called Iron Bell. Story 11. My name is Priscilla Vance, and I work as a rural mail carrier in the mountains of North Carolina, a job that has taken me down some of the most isolated stretches of road in the state for going on 14 years now. Most of my route runs along paved county roads, but a small handful of elderly residents still live along a stretch that passes close to an abandoned settlement called Iron Bell, a former smelting and foundry town that emptied out gradually through the 1970s and 80s as the last remaining families either passed away or moved closer to town for better access to medical care. In January of 2021, during an unusually harsh cold snap, I was delivering a package to the last remaining occupied house along that stretch, an elderly widower named Cletus Farrow, who lived alone about a quarter mile past the Iron Bell town boundary. Cletus was not home when I arrived, his truck missing from the drive, so I left the package on his porch as usual and started back toward my vehicle. And it was on that walk back that I first noticed, drifting from the direction of the old foundry ruins visible through bare winter trees, a deep rhythmic clanging, metal striking metal in a steady, almost musical pattern that I can only describe as sounding like the specific rhythm of a working forge. Iron Bell's foundry had not operated in well over 40 years by that point, its buildings reduced mostly to collapsed brick walls and rusted equipment, too heavy for scrappers to bother hauling out. I stood beside my mail truck for a long moment, listening to that sound, telling myself it was likely some trick of wind moving through the ruined structures, though there was almost no wind that particular afternoon, the cold air still and heavy in the way it gets during a hard freeze. The clanging continued at a steady, unhurried pace, and beneath it, fainter, I began to make out what sounded like men's voices, calling brief instructions back and forth to one another, the specific clipped rhythm of a crew working in close coordination on something demanding and precise. I left without investigating further that day. Mail routes do not leave much room for detours, but I made a point afterward asking a few of my older regular customers along that route whether they knew anything about Iron Bell's history. And one elderly woman told me, without much surprise in her voice, that the foundry had lost several workers over the decades to accidents on the forge floor, and that locals had long claimed you could still hear the place working some cold afternoons, as though the crew simply never got the message that the foundry had closed for good. And that locals had long claimed you could still hear the place working some cold afternoons, as though the crew simply never got the message that the foundry had closed for good. I have delivered that route for 14 years now, and I have heard that same sound exactly 3 more times since, always on the coldest days of the year, always in the early afternoon, never lasting more than a few minutes before fading back into ordinary silence. I no longer stop to listen when it happens. I simply finish my delivery and drive on, the way you learn to do with anything on a long, familiar route that you have decided, for your own peace of mind, not to investigate too closely. Cletus Farrow passed away the following winter, and when his house eventually went up for sale, I found myself, out of an impulse I still cannot fully explain, driving the long way around rather than past Iron Bell on my final delivery to that address, a small private goodbye to a route I had grown strangely fond of despite everything, or perhaps because of it. If your job has ever taken you somewhere that made you question what you were hearing, we want to know about it in the comments below. Finally, tonight, a land surveyor named August Meeker finds his compass turning against him near a forgotten cemetery in a settlement called Dunmore, and it may be the strangest account of the night. Story 12. My name is August Meeker, and I work as a land surveyor across several counties in eastern Kentucky, a job that regularly sends me out to establish or confirm property boundaries on parcels that have not been formally surveyed in generations, some of them overlapping old settlements that show up only as faint markings on decades-old plat maps. In June of 2023, I was contracted to survey a large tract that included the remains of a settlement called Dunmore, a small farming and blacksmithing community that had thinned out steadily through the early 20th century, before a final handful of holdout families left sometime in the 1940s after a prolonged drought made the surrounding farmland unworkable. I worked that survey mostly alone over the course of 4 days, setting up my equipment at various points across the tract and walking long stretches between them to establish sight lines. Dunmore itself sat near the center of the parcel, little more than a scatter of collapsed stone foundations, and one leaning smokehouse that had somehow survived largely intact. On my 3rd day, working a boundary line that ran directly through what would have been the town's small cemetery, a modest plot marked by a dozen or so weathered fieldstones, with no legible inscriptions left on any of them, I began to notice that my equipment was behaving strangely, my compass needle drifting several degrees off true north whenever I stood within roughly 50 feet of that cemetery, correcting itself perfectly the moment I stepped beyond that radius. I have surveyed land long enough to know that magnetic anomalies happen, old buried metal, mineral deposits, and certain rock formations, and I spent a good portion of that afternoon trying to identify a reasonable physical cause, checking for old fence wire, farm equipment, anything buried that might explain the drift. I found nothing, no metal, no unusual geology, nothing in the soil composition that differed meaningfully from the rest of the tract. It was during that search, crouched near one of the weathered fieldstones, running a metal detector slowly across the ground, that I heard, close behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone exhaling, a long, tired breath let out the way a person does after a full day of hard physical labor. And when I turned, expecting to find another surveyor from a neighboring parcel who had wandered over, I found the cemetery exactly as empty as it had been all afternoon. My own footprints, the only ones visible in the soft ground. I finished marking that boundary line as quickly as professional standards allowed, compass drift and all, filing a note in my official report about the magnetic anomaly, the kind of dry technical language that lets you document something strange without ever having to explain what you actually think it means. I asked around afterward, the way I usually do when a job leaves me with more questions than answers, and an older surveyor who had worked that same county for decades told me Dunmore's smithy had lost its blacksmith unexpectedly sometime before the town's final decline, found collapsed at his forge one morning by his own son. The exact cause never fully agreed upon by the family, though most versions of the story settled on simple exhaustion. A man who had quietly worked himself to death, trying to hold a dying town together a little longer than it had any right to survive. I have surveyed a great many old settlements since Dunmore, and I have learned to trust my compass a little less blindly than I used to, and to pay a little more attention when it starts telling me something my eyes cannot yet confirm. If you thought 12 accounts was where tonight ended, stay with us, because a cell tower technician named Garrison Locke is about to tell you what he saw from 300 feet up, looking down on a town called Thistledown, and it does not get any easier to hear from here. Story 13. My name is Garrison Locke, and I work as a cell tower technician for a regional carrier in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, which means I spend a good part of my working life several hundred feet in the air, climbing towers to service equipment that most people never think about unless their signal drops. In April of 2021, I was dispatched to a tower situated on a ridge overlooking a valley that had once held a settlement called Thistledown, a small farming and tan bark community that had been gradually abandoned through the 1960s as younger generations left for factory work in bigger towns and never came back to take over the family land. The tower itself sat well outside the old town boundary, close enough that on a clear day you could see the collapsed roof lines of Thistledown laid out below like a scale model, but far enough that I had never given the place much thought beyond noting it as a landmark for orienting myself on the climb. That April morning was unusually clear, blue sky with none of the low ridge fog that normally hangs over that valley, and partway up the tower, pausing to rest at roughly the 200-foot mark, the way I always do to check my harness and catch my breath. I looked down toward Thistledown out of habit, and noticed movement in the old town's main clearing, a scatter of small figures, moving in a loose, unhurried pattern that struck me immediately as wrong, because nothing about that valley should have had visible foot traffic on a Tuesday morning, that far from any road. I climbed higher rather than lower, which I recognize now was probably not the wisest instinct, but curiosity has always gotten the better of caution in me, and from 300 feet the movement below became clearer without becoming any more explainable. What I was looking at, as best I could tell from that height, was a group of perhaps a dozen people moving through the old fields in slow, deliberate lines, the unmistakable rhythm of a harvest, bending and rising, in a coordinated pattern that no group of casual hikers or trespassers would ever bother maintaining. I radioed down to my ground man, a younger tech named Foster Whitlow, who was watching my line from the truck, and asked him to confirm whether he could see people moving in the valley below. He told me after a long pause that he could see the old fields clearly through his binoculars, and that they were completely empty, nothing moving at all. I stayed up that tower a good while longer than the job strictly required, watching that harvest continue below in a valley my own groundman swore was empty, until, all at once, the movement simply stopped, every figure going still in the same instant. And then one by one, beginning from the far edge of the clearing and moving inward, disappearing entirely, the way a light goes out room by room in a house being shut down for the night. Until all at once, the movement simply stopped, every figure going still in the same instant. And then, one by one, beginning from the far edge of the clearing and moving inward, disappearing entirely, the way a light goes out room by room in a house being shut down for the night. I climbed back down slower than I normally would, and Foster asked me, half joking, if I had seen a ghost up there, and I told him honestly that I did not know what else to call it. I looked into Thistledown's history afterward and found a brief mention in an old county agricultural report of a particularly brutal early frost sometime in the 1930s that destroyed an entire season's harvest before the community could bring it in. A loss severe enough that several families left the valley for good within the following year, rather than risk another season like it. I still service that tower every few months, and I will admit I no longer look down toward that valley while I climb. Not out of fear exactly, more out of a kind of respect for whatever work is apparently still being finished down there. If you've ever seen something from somewhere high up that made no sense once you got back to ground level, tell us about it below. Next, an insurance adjuster named Marlene Kessler investigates a routine fire claim near a place called Bellwright and finds a furnace that never should have still been burning. Story 14. My name is Marlene Kessler, and I work as an insurance adjuster specializing in rural property claims, mostly investigating fire and storm damage across mountain counties in West Virginia, where a lot of the housing stock is old, remote, and poorly documented. In August of 2020, I was assigned a claim involving a hunting cabin that had burned near the edge of a long abandoned settlement called Bellwright, a former glass factory town that had thrived briefly in the early 1900s, before the factory closed and the surrounding company housing emptied out within a handful of years. The cabin itself sat just outside Bellwright's old boundary, owned by a hunting club whose members used it seasonally, and my job was straightforward on paper: walk the burn site, document the cause and extent of damage, determine whether the claim held up against the policy's terms. I arrived on a hot, still afternoon, and after documenting the cabin's remains, which showed clear signs of an electrical fault rather than anything suspicious, I decided, mostly out of professional thoroughness, to walk the short distance into Bellwright itself, to check whether any embers or debris had drifted into the old town site, since a secondary claim involving historical property could complicate the club's coverage. Bellwright's most prominent remaining structure was the old glassworks itself, a long brick building with most of its roof collapsed, but its furnace stacks still standing, 3 tall brick chimneys rising above the tree line like fingers. I was maybe 50 yards from the glassworks, photographing the site for my report, when I noticed a faint orange glow flickering somewhere deep within the collapsed structure, the unmistakable color and movement of active fire, which alarmed me immediately given the dry conditions and the fact that I had just come from documenting one blaze already that day. I approached cautiously, prepared to call it in, and found, peering through a gap in the collapsed brickwork, that the glow was coming from what remained of one of the old furnace pits, still apparently burning, though cold ash and decades of undisturbed debris surrounded it on every side. And though no glassworks furnace had been fired in that building in well over a century, I backed away from that gap in the brickwork without calling anything in, some instinct telling me this was not a fire the county fire department would have any way of putting out. And by the time I glanced back a final time before returning to my car, the glow was gone entirely, the furnace pit dark and cold exactly as it should have been all along. I finished my report on the hunting cabin without mentioning Bellwright at all, since it had no bearing on the actual claim. But I looked into the glassworks history afterward and found a brief record of a furnace explosion in 1908 that killed 2 workers on a night shift, an accident the company reportedly downplayed at the time to avoid halting production, and one that, according to a short paragraph in an old regional trade journal, workers afterward claimed had left that particular furnace pit permanently haunted by the 2 men who died tending it. I have adjusted a great many fire claims since Bellwright, and I have learned to trust the specific color of a flame a little more than I used to. because ordinary fire and whatever I saw flickering in that furnace pit did not look the same, not even close. If you work a job that has ever taken you somewhere a fire had no business still burning, let us know in the comments. Coming up next, a cemetery caretaker named Ezra Colton finds fresh, disturbed earth in a burial ground with no living hands anywhere near it, at a place called Copper Vein. Story 15. My name is Ezra Colton, and I work as a cemetery caretaker and part-time genealogical researcher in the mountains of North Carolina. A job that mostly involves maintaining a handful of small historic burial grounds for a regional preservation society, and occasionally helping families trace lost relatives buried in forgotten plots. In October of 2022, the society sent me out to document and stabilize a small family cemetery attached to a vanished settlement called Copper Vein, a former copper mining camp that had operated only briefly in the late 1800s, before the vein played out and the town dissolved within a few short years. Copper Vein Cemetery sat on a low rise, overlooking where the main camp once stood, maybe 20 graves in total, most marked with plain fieldstones that had long since lost any legible carving. My job that week was simple enough: clear overgrowth, photograph and measure each stone, cross-reference whatever names I could recover against old mining company records to help the society build a more complete history of the site. I worked alone for most of the week, which is fairly normal for this kind of solitary documentation work. And it was on my third day, kneeling beside one particularly weathered stone, trying to make out a faint carved date, that I felt, very distinctly, the sensation of someone standing directly behind me, close enough that I expected to feel their shadow fall across my work. I turned and found no one there, the cemetery as empty as it had been all week, and told myself, as I often do in this line of work, that solitary hours among gravestones can play tricks on anyone's nerves after enough consecutive days. But the sensation returned within the hour, stronger this time, accompanied by a faint but unmistakable smell of turned earth, the specific smell of fresh digging rather than old settled ground. And when I looked toward the newest disturbance in my peripheral vision, I saw at the far edge of the cemetery a patch of soil that had clearly been recently overturned, dark and loose against the surrounding undisturbed grass, in a spot my own careful survey from 2 days prior had confirmed as bare, unmarked ground, with no burial recorded there in any document the society possessed. In a spot my own careful survey from 2 days prior had confirmed as bare, unmarked ground, with no burial recorded there in any document the society possessed. I did not disturb that patch of earth further, photographing it instead for my report, and noting the anomaly as precisely as I could manage while my hands were still steady enough to hold a camera properly. I finished the documentation project over the following days, always aware of that presence somewhere behind me, never quite gone. And when I submitted my final report to the Preservation Society, I included a respectful but honest note, recommending that any future excavation work at Copper Vein be approached with particular sensitivity, a recommendation I did not fully explain and that, to their credit, nobody at the Society pressed me to elaborate on. I still work cemetery documentation regularly, and I have come to believe more firmly than I ever expected to when I started this career, that some ground simply remembers who has been laid into it, whether or not any paperwork survives to confirm the fact. If you have ever felt watched somewhere you knew for certain you were alone, tell us about it below. Up next, a whitewater rafting guide named Selena Marchetti hears a voice calling out over the current, near the ruins of a quarry town called Slate Fork. Story 16. My name is Selena Marchetti, and I have worked as a whitewater rafting guide across several rivers in the southern Appalachians for almost 12 years, leading commercial trips through some genuinely remote stretches of water that pass close to a number of abandoned settlements along the old riverbanks. In July of 2019, I was guiding a small private trip down a stretch of river that runs directly past the remains of a settlement called Slate Fork, a former quarrying town that had been gradually reclaimed by forest after the quarry closed in the 1950s, its buildings visible in glimpses through the trees from the water at certain points along the run. My clients that day were a group of 4 experienced paddlers. We had planned a leisurely run with a lunch stop on a gravel bar directly across from where Slate Fork's old quarry office still stood, one of the few structures in the area still holding a mostly intact roofline. We beached the rafts and set up lunch on the gravel bar, and it was while we were eating that one of my clients, a quiet man in his 50s who had said little all morning, asked me in a carefully neutral tone whether anyone else could see a figure standing in the upper window of the quarry office across the water. I looked where he was pointing and saw nothing. An empty dark window frame in an otherwise unremarkable ruined building. And none of the other 3 clients reported seeing anything either. He did not push the point, and we finished lunch and continued downriver without further incident. But as we paddled past the quarry office itself, close enough now to see the building clearly rather than glimpse it through trees, I noticed the same client go very still in his seat. And later, once we had reached the takeout and the other clients had wandered off toward the parking area, he told me quietly that as we passed beneath that window, he had heard, clear as anything over the sound of the current, a woman's voice calling out a name that was not his, twice, with what he described as real desperation, as though calling for someone who had gone somewhere she could not follow, as though calling for someone who had gone somewhere she could not follow. I asked him if he wanted to talk to someone about it, thinking of the mild disorientation heat and long hours on the water can sometimes cause. But he seemed calm, almost thoughtful rather than shaken, and told me he had lost his own wife 2 years earlier, and that something about the way that voice called out had felt less frightening than familiar. A strange thing to admit, but one I did not doubt he meant sincerely. I looked into Slate Fork's history afterward and found a brief account describing a quarry accident in the 1930s that killed a foreman, survived by a wife who reportedly never fully accepted the company's account of what happened, and was said to have returned to that quarry office window regularly in the years afterward, watching the water, before she herself passed away, still waiting for an explanation nobody ever gave her. I still guide that stretch of river every summer, and I always slow the pace slightly as we pass beneath that window now, without ever fully explaining to my clients why. If a place has ever called out to you in a voice you were not expecting, tell us about it below. Finally tonight, a propane delivery driver named Foster Lindquist follows a trail of smoke to a chimney that has not held a fire in decades, near a settlement called Harlan's Crossing. Story 17. My name is Foster Lindquist, and I drive a propane delivery truck across several rural counties in Tennessee, a job that in winter months regularly takes me down isolated roads to service tanks at hunting cabins, seasonal homes, and the occasional holdout residence near settlements that emptied out generations ago. In January of 2023, during a bitter cold snap, I had a scheduled delivery to a hunting cabin situated close to the edge of a long abandoned town called Harlan's Crossing, a former ferry and trading settlement that had died out slowly after a new highway bridge rerouted traffic away from the crossing entirely, sometime in the 1950s. The delivery itself was routine, a straightforward tank fill for a cabin owner I had serviced several times before, but on my way back to the truck I noticed, through the bare winter trees toward Harlan's Crossing, what looked unmistakably like smoke rising from a chimney among the ruins, thin and steady against the pale winter sky, exactly the kind of smoke a fire produces once it has been burning a good while, rather than one just freshly lit. Curious despite the cold, and with a little time to spare before my next scheduled stop, I walked the short distance toward the old town site to get a better look, telling myself it was probably squatters or hunters who had taken shelter in one of the more intact structures. I found the source of the smoke easily enough, rising from the chimney of what had likely been the old ferrykeeper's house, one of the few Harlan's Crossing buildings still holding most of its roof. I knocked on the door out of simple courtesy, unwilling to just walk in on whoever might be sheltering there in that kind of cold. And when no one answered, I pushed the door open to check that everyone inside was safe, only to find the house entirely empty. No fire, no hearth even laid with wood. Cold ash undisturbed in a fireplace that showed no evidence of having been used in longer than I could reasonably guess, though the smoke I had watched rising from that same chimney not 2 minutes earlier had been unmistakably real. I stood in that cold doorway for a long moment, looking at a fireplace that had clearly not held a fire in decades. And I want to be honest that I did not linger to investigate further, closing the door carefully behind me and walking back to my truck at a pace faster than the cold alone could account for. I finished my remaining deliveries that day and made a point afterward of asking the cabin owner I had just serviced whether he knew anything about the old ferrykeeper's house. And he told me, without much surprise, that the ferrykeeper himself had reportedly died alone. One hard winter after the bridge rerouted all his customers elsewhere. Found weeks later by a neighbor who noticed no smoke had risen from that chimney in far too long. An absence, ironically, that had first raised the alarm the way its opposite raised mine. I still deliver propane to that same stretch of road every winter, and I keep half an eye on that chimney every single time I pass it, half hoping and half dreading that I will see that same smoke rising again, steady and patient, waiting for someone to finally come check on whoever it is that still seems to be keeping that hearth going. That is the last of tonight's 17 accounts. And if you made it through all of them, we mean it sincerely when we say thank you for spending this much time in these hollows with us. That brings us to the end of tonight's 17 accounts. From park ranger files, an estate appraiser, a power lineman, an urban explorer, a well driller, a hospice nurse, a drone surveyor, a church restoration contractor, a game warden, a large animal veterinarian, a timber cruiser, a rural mail carrier, a land surveyor, a cell tower technician, an insurance adjuster, a cemetery caretaker, a whitewater rafting guide, and a propane delivery driver. 17 ordinary people with 17 ordinary jobs, all of them walking into towns that the maps have already forgotten, and all of them walking back out carrying something they never expected to bring home with them. What strikes me most, putting these accounts together, is how ordinary the people telling them are. None of them went looking for anything strange. None of them were thrill seekers chasing a scare. They were doing their jobs, the same kinds of jobs people do every single day across these mountains. And the mountains answered back in a way none of them were prepared for. There's something these 17 stories share beyond the obvious thread of abandoned towns and things that should not still be there. Every single one of these people describes a moment of being seen, of realizing that whatever they encountered was not simply a leftover echo of the past playing on a loop, but something aware, something that noticed them specifically and responded to their presence. A wall that added a name, a store that kept a shopkeeper waiting, a cellar that counted along with a stranger, a chimney that remembered a woman who refused to leave it behind, a stretch of road that reached out and pulled someone home, a river that replayed its worst day for an audience of one, a church that kept rearranging itself until someone finally understood what it was asking for, a scale that still weighs goods for customers who never return, a warehouse door still trying to let something out, an axe still splitting wood for a quota that no longer exists, a forge still working a shift that ended half a century ago, a compass that still remembers where a tired man finally laid down his tools, a harvest still being brought in by hands that finished their work generations ago, a furnace that still burns for two men and never got the chance to properly mourn, a grave still being dug for someone the records forgot to remember, A voice still calling out across the water for someone it lost. A hearth still being kept lit by someone waiting for a visitor who finally, after all this time, came to check on it. These are not hauntings in the simple sense of shadows and cold spots. These are places that have held onto something so tightly for so long that they have started reaching back out toward the living, testing to see who might still be listening. If you have your own account of an abandoned town, an old coal camp, a flooded settlement, a church nobody visits anymore, we want to hear it. Drop it in the comments below, because some of our best episodes have come directly from viewers, just like you sharing what happened to them out in these hollows. And if tonight kept you company through a long drive, a late shift, or a night you did not want to spend in total silence, that is exactly what this channel is here for. Please take a moment right now to hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells us these stories are reaching the people who need them. Subscribe if you have not already, turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload, and share this video with somebody you know who still does not believe these places are as empty as they look. We put a lot of care into finding and telling these accounts, and every like, every comment, and every share genuinely helps this channel keep growing, so we can keep bringing you more of them. One last thought before we close out tonight. Every one of the 17 people you heard from tonight went back to their ordinary lives after what happened to them. They kept working their jobs, kept driving those same roads, kept walking into other old buildings and other quiet hollows, because that is simply what the work required of them. And because most of us, when something we cannot explain crosses our path, do not get the luxury of stopping our lives to make sense of it. We just carry it forward, a little more careful, a little more aware, and we keep going. That is, in many ways, the truest thread running through everything you heard tonight. Not the fear itself, but the quiet, steady way ordinary people learn to live alongside it. Thank you for spending tonight with Park Ranger Files. Keep your porch light on, lock your doors, and we will see you in the next one.